All right. Good morning for all you early morning people. I'm not a necessarily early morning people, but I guess I am today because it's really 5:30 to my internal clock. So thanks for coming. Today, hopefully I get this little clicker working. This is we're going to talk about moving applications to the cloud. How many people have actually used Windows Azure? Oh, good, a fair number of people. You don't count in the back. So my name is Scott Dinsmore. I'm a senior developer on the Microsoft Patterns and Practices team. How many people have heard of Patterns and Practices? Good. Well, hopefully I can do it some justice today. There we go. This session's got a little slide that's all screwed up, but it is developer focused. It was supposed to be a white background, but it kind of got, I guess when they uploaded it kind of got changed. So if you can read that code, better for you because that's kind of messed up. But it's going to be developer focused. We're talking a little bit about expectations about what we're going to talk about today. So if you're interested in a lot of IT stuff, I can't guarantee you that I will go very deep into that. But we will be looking at a lot of code and walking through a lot of code today. So if you're a developer and interested in that, it's awesome. My assumption here is also that you know a little bit about Windows Azure. If you don't, you'll see that at the edge of the little slides that I've always put down here, those are sessions that you can look at or go back and look online and look at, go to. I think this one was actually yesterday, so if you can get it online. These are sessions that you can find out more. So I think that one is the introduction to Windows Azure, kind of gives you an overview of all of Windows Azure. So if you see those at the little bottom of the slides, that's actually sessions that you can go to find out more information. So there's about any of the deep technical content on Windows Azure. Because we only have like an hour and 15 minutes, so I can't give you the whole deep dive on every little piece. And the plan for today, for the next hour and 5 minutes or so, is to walk through a simple case study of actually moving an application to the cloud. How many people have actually tried moving one of their applications to Windows Azure? Cool. So we got a couple of people back there. Good. All the cool kids in the back of the room, they've tried it. So that we're going to do that. We're going to walk through a little bit of a case study. This is actually based on a book that we did called Moving Applications to the Cloud, so that we can actually go through and look through the code and kind of give you an example of all those things. So here, we'll dive right in, is the application. This is a very simple application. It's called AExpense, an expense reporting application. It's probably something you've built or done before, maybe not an expense application, but an application that looks similar to this, where I've got a website that I deploy, I'm using Windows authentication through Active Directory, I'm passing those credentials through to SQL Server, I'm using Active Directory to authenticate with SQL Server, I'm logging everything to the event log or some kind of log that I want to use to actually store exceptions or log information about how my application is running. and using membership services, user profile through ASP.NET. So this is a typical ASP.NET app. Everybody's seen this probably or built this before. But what are the real challenges about actually moving this application to the cloud? And that's what we're going to talk about today, is moving this application into Windows Azure. And what are the challenges you're going to face when actually moving your application to the cloud? Well, the first thing you're going to find out is there's no Active Directory in the cloud. So how do I, as a developer, move that, uncouple myself from this, excuse me, from this Active Directory, but still have authentication and some type of identity associated with my application? The second thing you're going to find out is there's some interesting things about session and how we do things in ASP.NET and how the browser communicates and where we go for Windows Azure. And the next thing we're going to talk about is how do I do diagnostics? How do I do my event logging? There is an event log in Windows Azure, but what do I actually do now? What do I actually have to do to make all this work again for me? And how do I flow credentials back to SQL Server, or even can I do that now that we've eliminated Active Directory? What do I do now? How do I deal with my identity back to SQL Server, and how do I deal with that connection back to SQL Server? And how do I deal with things like talking to the website, where it's at, all those different things. Where do I locate it, and how does my browser communicate back to the website? None of these things are very complicated, but we want to break these down. And there's actually a couple of things more I will probably talk about, which is, say for example, this application spits out files for SAP or somebody to pick up that actually runs creating the expense check or something like that. How does that do? So if I had some Windows services that actually looked in the file log to say, I want to get a file and pick it up, batch it over to SAP, and actually shove it over into SAP so that it can print me a check at the end of the month for all my expenses. So we're going to do a quick little demo, and I'm going to show you this application. And the free Ferrari is at the end of if you have to stay to the whole end of the session. And show you this application and show you exactly what we're talking about. So let's run this one. And this is just, like I said, it's a simple ASP.NET app. It's using Windows Auth. We're simulating Windows Auth since I don't want to have Active Directory and everything hooked up here. So normally you would see this little pop-up and or you would already be logged into your computer and see that. We'll log in as John Doe. This application is hooked up to SQL Server. I've already got some things in here. It's a pretty simple application. I've got John and Mary. John is the employee. Mary is his manager. We've got some things set up in membership profile about how he wants to get paid. So I can actually go in. If I wanted to add an expense, I could give it the date, title, what kind of reimbursement method I wanted. This is actually part of my preferences within my profile. And then I can say who's the approver. This is coming from Active Directory, like my manager chain of who that wants to do and what cost center I'm in. All that information is coming from Active Directory. I can pull all that information out of my Active Directory. So it's pretty simple. I can add like, and we'll be seeing this multiple times. So I won't make you go through this. But if I go and log out and log back in as Mary, I can actually see that I can approve. I'm a manager, so she has a role. There's different roles within this application. I have a role of manager, so I know that I can now approve John's actual expenses, which would be awesome if I could do both. I could put in my expense and I can approve it, but eventually they might catch on. So it's a pretty simple application. So let's go back over here to our PowerPoint. So everybody get that? That's pretty simple, no big deal. But one of the first things that you're going to do, and I think this is probably one of the most important things, is how do I now say, now that I've got John and Mary associated with this application, and I've always got them logging in, and of course I could have more and more employees logging into this application, how do I deal with identity? How do I go and say, all right, I've got John, I got Mary, they're all hooked into my Active Directory, but what do I do now? I don't have Active Directory anymore. So one of the things that you can do is claims enable your application. How many people have done claims? 1, 2, okay. Well, I'm going to, hopefully today, I'm not going to go deep dive into it, but I'm going to show you how to do it really quickly. Again, if you want to go see more about that, there's a couple of good sessions. We call him Captain Identity, Vittorio, who is a great session on claims. He's the, I would say, expert in the field here. And you can go find out more about that. But basically, I'll give you a quick overview. Claims basically allows you to attach properties to your principal without going too deep into the technical piece. And, excuse me, and say, here's the role, here's the name of the person. All that information that usually comes from Active Directory can be put into these claims. And if you look at this claim type, you'll see here on the screen, this is a WIF configuration section, and we'll talk about WIF in a second. About here's name and role. I can have different properties associated with that, and that gets turned into this token. This token gets passed along through the browser back to the application, and when you do that, that token can be parsed by the application and then turns into a principal that gets attached to your HTTP context.current user. So let's walk through kind of a simple example of that. So when you set up these things, and claims, it's a big section. We actually have a book on this. I'll give you a little bit more information about where you can pick up all these books at the end of the session. But you can create, with your Windows Azure app, let's say AExpense, and ADATM is this company that we're talking about that owns AExpense. You can set up this trust relationship between your application and what they call an identity provider. So how many people have used ADFS? Couple? Okay, ADFS is a, excuse me, is a product we have that allows you, it's kind of acts as an identity provider. So it sits in front of Active Directory and can actually issue claims tokens for you. And once you set up this trust relationship, a trust relationship is nothing more like a contract. It actually doesn't, you don't do any kind of coding or anything to set up this trust relationship. You're just saying, my application, which in claims terms we call a relying party, is actually set up to trust this identity provider, which is 8Atom's Active Directory ADFS, exposed on the internet. You can securely expose that on the internet. And once that trust is set up, when the browser, say I'm in 8Atom and I'm going to call out to Windows Azure in the cloud to actually use my application, the browser gets redirected back to your identity provider, because what we do is we actually enable WIF. We tell WIF, and I'm going to walk you through a complete demo of how to do this. So just follow along for a second, and we'll show you the code, and it'll become much more clear. WIF, Windows Identity Foundation, which is part of Windows and actually has an SDK, and we'll show you that in a second, will actually go out and get that token. It will get redirected to get a token that I talked about from the identity provider. And in that token, you can put all kinds of claims information. So I can have, again, my names, my roles, my manager, just a ton of information passed back and forth across the wire. And once it gets that token, I can then send that token along, which is actually just a form request, back to WIF. WIF will parse that token, turn it into a claims principal, which is just an I principal. And if you dealt with any kind of identity in .NET, you've seen this I principal and I identity. And once that claims principal gets set, it will get set for the current user in the session. And I now have access to the principal. Now, if you think about that and what I just said, if you were already using Windows Authentication and you were using principal and you were using like isEnroll or any of those operations off the principal object, guess what? We've claims enabled the application, but we didn't have to change the application. Because if I'm already using a principal object and an identity object within my AExpense application, I don't have to change anything. Because all I did was enabled WIF, and I added it to my application. It turned what was before a Windows principal into a claims principal. And through some magic, and again, I say go to the Victorio's talk if you want to know more about it, but it basically reads that token, parses it, and it shows, and it takes some of those claim types and turns, and we have a name and a role claim type. Those are kind of the main ones you saw on that screen before, a couple screens back. It takes those and maps name and role into name and role from a principal. So you have all your roles and the name, which is the identity, the username. So you actually have all those same things. So by doing that, you actually don't change much about your application. So let's real quickly show you what I mean by that. So let's first, we'll close this guy down. Let's first kind of walk through. I'm going to show you the application claims enabled. So this kind of says each one of these Visual Studio projects is actually kind of a movement between what we're talking about. So I'm going to claims enable my application. So once I do that, you will see that we no longer get this Windows authentication. Of course, it's deploying, and we're on HTTPS. And actually, we have a localhost cert, but because when you're running in Windows Azure, you're actually running on the computer emulator, the compute emulator. You can see that we're going at 127.0.0.1, all that good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and continue, even though it says it's not recommended. And you see what we call a simulated issuer. So an issuer is the same thing as an identity provider. It basically issues tokens out to you. It's also called a secure token service, STS. And you will see now, we're just simulating, again, something like ADFS. Normally, you would get logged into ADFS, and it would ask you to type in your domain account and your password, and all of a sudden, you're going to go, oh, I can do all that, and it will redirect you. But you can see, real quick, oops, not that one. Thank you. Up here, we're over in this different location called localhost 8atom.simulated-issuer. So we actually went from the compute environment, the computer emulator in Windows Azure, which is running locally on my computer, to an IIS, which is running also locally on my computer. But you can imagine that that's actually redirecting. The browser got redirected over to a different address. There's a bunch of information in there, and I'll show you that in just a second. But once I've done that, I can continue in with my login. And we really didn't change anything about the application, But I can log in as John again. And as I slowly get redirected over to my compute environment, I will then get added back. I will then show up in the application, and I will be John again. But I didn't change anything about the application. So if we went to the first application and looked at principals, all those different things that we use, and user, none of that got changed. And for some reason, it is running terribly slow right now. Come on. Thinking about it? All right. We'll come back to it. There we go. As soon as I say it, we're going to come back to that. But anyways, so you'll see I didn't really do anything. I still got logged in as ADATM John Doe, even though I didn't really go against this Windows authentication. Our Windows, I don't have a Windows principal anymore. I now have something called a claims principal. And I can still log out, log back in. You see, we actually have, this actually one is going against the same SQL Server instance. So we see have the same information. We have the same user. I've got all that information back into me. So let me show you real quick how I actually did this, because I think that's actually going to give you a little bit more insight into how this works. So I actually have a start of a project, an MVC application. You could do this with ASP.NET as well. And I'm going to show you how easy it is. Right now, if I run this application, and I have to do this because I need to copy this little address real quick. And I actually already set this up beforehand. And I log onto this application just using regular Forms Auth. This could have been Forms Auth. This could have been Windows Auth. And I log in. I think I logged in as wrong name. But anyway, I can log in as Scott Dan, which is actually my user account that I set up for this machine. And it said it would log me in as Scott Dan. But if I want to actually set up and say, I want to redirect to like an STS, that could be like ADFS, again, that's a secure token service, it's easy to do. Let me show you how I can do this. I can go in here, oops, if I click on the right one here, and I can say add STS reference. Now what this is the Windows Identity Foundation SDK. And it's going to tell me, I'm going to tell it, I want to actually claims enable my application. And what it's going to do, it's going to do a bunch of little work for me. I said, yes, I don't care. It's not HTTPS. I want to create a new STS project in this current solution. Again, this is just a simulated issuer. If I go to next, it's going to say, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to finish all this. You see it created a little STS in here. But what it did, if we go down here to our web config. Oh, I have to wait for it to finish. Yes, I know. Thank you. I can go down here to our web config. Let's get this out of the way so we can see it. Before, our authentication mode was forms. It commented that out for us, and now it added a couple of new modules for us into our HTTP runtime. And it actually is called Federation Module and Session Authentication Module. Added them here into System Web Services too, so we can use IS7. And down here at the bottom, you will see that it added a bunch of information, just like you saw on that first slide when we talked about identity. And what that did is basically said, I'm going to, this audience URI, that's my application, this is my relying party. I'm going to use this issuer, which is our local host, which is the guy that WIF just set up for us, to actually issue tokens for this application. So if I run this now, I'll go to localhost, and then it should just redirect me to this local STS. And now I can log in, and again, this is not hooked up to any AD or anything like that. I can log in as Adam Carter, which is just the default that this guy gets set up as. WIF will actually come back, set the user principal, and you can see I'm signed in as Adam Carter. It was that easy to actually set myself up with claims. So all I had to do was I actually said create an STS. Normally you would, a lot of this stuff is walked through the book. We don't have a whole lot of time to dig into it today. But that was as simple as it was to set up claims. But you saw that I didn't change anything about my application. I can still log in, and I can still set the current principal or the current user, which is and then have the principal set up for me. And now I've got an identity for my application. Let's just close this guy out. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, it's relatively, I know I went through a lot of wizards and magic there, but it's a relatively simple exercise. That exactly what what I just did is what we did for that application. So if when you saw the beginning when I had it as Windows Authentication, I basically we ran the STS wizard. And what you do is instead of creating a new one, we could point it at an existing STS. And when you're pointing at the existing STS and you tell it, here's a bunch of, it'll ask you to tell it where the federation metadata is. And again, if you want to know more about that, go see Vittorio's talk. It will say, I will pull all that information, and that metadata just says, here's all the claims information about that. And once I do that, now my app is claims enabled. I can actually start actually moving that up to the cloud and have, when I hit it, again, get a token from my local STS, which is ADFS or any other claims provider or identity provider. So next thing I want to talk a little bit about is session and profile. So how many people have built ASP.NET apps on a web farm? Yes? So the first thing you realize is that you can't have local session because since session is tied to the computer, it becomes affinitized, and you need to kind of do something to where do I put my session so I can store it. So there's certain things you can do in session and profile. You can store it in SQL Server. So if I wanted to move this application, I could definitely move everything into SQL Azure. But another way you could do this is table storage, and blob storage. If you know a little bit about Windows Azure, table storage, blob storage, there's another two storage opportunities inside of Windows Azure. So what I can do is I can say, instead of storing my session in SQL Azure or blob or my profile in SQL Azure, I can store it into table storage. And what the Windows Azure SDK before came with that, there's been some modifications to it, but there are some providers that are built for doing just that. So you can see, we won't go through this example, but I'll show it to you in just a second, but you can see that in this config section, I've got like table storage provider, I've got for all my different pieces, I just, instead of using SQL as my provider, which was using the original application, I changed my config file using these providers now. Now my provider's information will be set up and pushed into this table storage. And it works just like the same. I still say profile dot or membership dot off of ASP.NET, and the same thing just works. Also, your session then gets stored into excuse me, blob storage and table storage, and then so all my session information for that particular user for that session is stored just like it is in SQL Azure, just like it is in SQL Server locally if you're running. So that is actually a pretty easy change too. When I moved that application, so far we ran the STS wizard, we pointed it at our identity provider. We assumed that we were using iPrincipal and iUser, so that was a pretty easy change. We've changed the session and profile by changing our config file to start using table storage. You could switch it to use SQL Azure, and that's a pretty easy change. So, not too bad so far. Yes? How are you charged for that? So, cost we'll get to in a minute, but charge, so SQL Azure is a one-month charge fee, whereas table storage is charged by transaction and storage. And there's, so we'll get to a little bit the costing at the end, but those are good things to think about when you start thinking about how I want to move. If you go purely SQL Azure and you make everything, SQL Server to SQL Server, it's a 1 month charge for, I think it's 50 gig databases. I can't remember exactly how much it is off the top of my head. And then in table storage, you're charged per transaction. A transaction means every read and write is one transaction. It's a penny per 10,000, and so it's not a big deal. And then it's like 12 cents or 10 cents a gig for storage. And again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think those are correct. And you can come by the Windows Azure booth if you want to know more about that as well. So let's talk a little bit about exception handling, logging, diagnostics. How many people actually have heard of Enterprise Library and or used it? Oh, wow, good many of you. Cool. So one of the things you can do, you can see here if you've ever used it before, that's actually something that we were using. We actually use in this application. So if you had used Enterprise Library before, there's really no changes you need to make for logging, except now you want to use something called the Windows Azure Diagnostics Trace Listener. So instead of going to the event log, I can actually move things into the Diagnostics Trace Listener. And that allows me to trace things out, and I'm going to show you here in just a second, moving information to to the Windows Azure logs. And you can get things like IIS logs, Windows dumps, event logs, all that different stuff. And you can actually transfer that data down, look at it, analyze it, figure out if you're having performance problems, bottlenecks. You can look at any kind of information errors that you want to. But I want to show you a little bit about how easy it is to do that. Because all we did in our application, since we were using logging and tracing, all we did was change the traceless logging to going to the event log to using this Windows Azure Diagnostic Trace Listener. And I'll show you that real quick. And that was as pretty easy as moving that part of the application. So let me make sure I'm showing you the right one here. Oops. Let me go over here and make sure I've got this right one set up. And I'll show you real quick how you do that. So you can see here I've got this log.write event kind information, and it's just saying starting application. So what I'm saying is I'm going to log, and this is just a kind of wrapper over the tracing stuff so that I can do this all in one line. You also see, if I go over here to the write method, that it's just calling trace, which is normal Windows Trace Listener, .NET Trace Listening information you just call trace, and whatever trace listener is set up for it to go to, it will then go to. And right now, we've set everything up to go to this Azure Diagnostics. And what you can do is, if you haven't seen this before, this is the compute emulator, and it's kind of emulates the Windows Azure environment. I'm going to run this real quick, and you'll see that when we run this emulator, once it starts deploying, it will start logging a bunch of information out, but you'll also see that it will log out any trace information that you do. And I'm just showing you that, so instead of having to go through and getting the logs and pulling them off, going through all that. You'll see that I'm calling up the role entry, and again, that's just how Windows Azure starts up. And you see that here, it actually wrote out, I'm starting up the application, which is exactly what I wrote out. So that would get logged out to Diagnostics. I could then go out and grab all that information from Windows Azure and parse those logs, whatever they may be. They may be events, errors, all those different pieces to get the information about my application. So if you have loggings already set up in your infrastructure or your application, it's pretty much as easy as changing your trace listener. So if you're using Log4Net or Enterprise Library or something like that, they usually all support some kind of trace listener. You can do that, change it. Your application should work exactly the same. So that's a pretty easy change to make as well. So far, not so bad. We haven't, if you think about where we've come, we haven't done a whole lot to the application itself to change it. We've just made some configuration changes, and we've added that STS for the claims. Not a whole heck of a lot going on there. Now, one of the big things people want to know is, how do I access my data? So we're going to focus in on this application around two little pieces, the expense row and the expense item row. So if you think about this application, every time I create an expense, I have one expense row, which should have, like who created it, the title, the date, if it was approved or not, what cost center, all that information. And then each row is, I can have like one expense that has multiple things. So maybe on, today I could say, here I'm going to expense out my breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I'm going to do that for one day. So let's focus a little bit around that, and I'm going to show you kind of the changes we have to make to do that. So first thing I want to show you is the beginning one. And then we'll move on to each individual one. So if we look at this application was built with, I think we used link to SQL in this one just to make this simple. We're going to focus in on the save expense method. And you'll see that in ours, we just use the context from the model that we created, and we actually just attach those entities because they already have that relationship set up. We attach those entities and submit it, all the changes. Pretty simple stuff if you use SQL Server or Link SQL or any framework. It's very similar. So that's pretty easy. And this is the actual begin solution. Now, if we move over to the SQL Server, or SQL Azure, so this is where we go. We're going to move from on-premise SQL Server to Cloud SQL Azure. Anybody want to take a guess what it looks like? How many people think it should look the same? Okay. For the rest of you, that was the right answer. Those that missed that one, that was the right answer. So let's just go look at the expense repository. If we look at the save expense, wow, that looks almost the exact same. Now, I will forewarn you that there is, it shouldn't look exactly the same. There are some interesting things when you deal with SQL Azure. You should actually have some sort of retry logic in here because of the fact that connections get cut off differently. I will use that word. Than it does on your on-premise. Remember, we're running things in the cloud, so things are going to be a little bit different. We actually are updating this content to actually include that. That was kind of came after we delivered this. But for the most part, exactly the same. So when I move my application to SQL Azure, that is probably the least painful thing to do. Now, you may have some limitations because of the 50 gig limit, so maybe you need to move it over to table storage where you have a lot more storage space. But of course, they're coming out with SQL Azure now. They're coming out with how you do federation and partitions and things like that that will help you get past that 50 gig limit. So pretty simple stuff, exactly the same. So let's focus a little bit on table storage. And let's look at, this solution is actually where we've moved our data access over to table storage. So you see, as we go through these, they're pretty much exactly the same. The application hasn't changed a whole lot. We still have expense items, expense everything. And if we look at where we move to table storage, let's go down here to our save expense. There's a little bit different, but it's similar. Not a whole lot more code added into saving the expense. So when we save the expense now, we still have a data context. So if you're familiar with data context from Entity Framework and all those different pieces, there is still something called a table storage context. So that makes it pretty simple to when you move your application over. And all I'm doing now, instead of having, since it doesn't know about their relationship, and I'll talk about that in a second. Table storage doesn't know about relationships. I'm actually building that relationship on the fly. So I'm actually I'm saving each one of the items that we talked about before, and then I save the actual header. So I'm actually saving the child rows first, and then the parent row. And let me explain to you why I do that. So one of the things you'll notice is that there's no transaction around here. There's no anything. Well, there's no transactions in table storage. I shouldn't say that. There are transactions in table storage, but not across tables. They're only across partitions, and we'll talk about that in a second. So what this does is, now that I have my expense data context and I'm saving all my child items, the reason I save the child items first is if, for example, the child item said, or if I had a problem between saving the child items and the actual header item, I will not have something show up on the expense report that has a header item but no child items. So I can then have some kind of difference between the two. So that's a pretty easy change, pretty easy thing to do. You will have to say if I have these child items and and they're orphaned per se, I will have to have some kind of way to clean those up. But we're going to talk about in just a second how to solve, maybe even a better way to solve that problem. But basically, I'm going to add all my item rows to my context. I'm going to add my header item, and then I'm going to save the changes. And again, this is saving the changes on the child items first. I'll come down here, I'll add the items for my expense row, and I'll save those changes. And then I'll have two items, or my items and my header row inside of table storage. So let's take a look at table storage real quick, because I want to show you something. So this tool is actually a tool I use, Cerebrata. It actually is a kind of a explorer for your local dev fabric or what's running up in Windows Azure in the cloud. Table storage, blob storage, my containers, these are all, and queues. So if I look at my tables, I want to show you kind of what that looks like. Whoops, sorry. These are items, and these are expenses. So you can see that in here, it kind of looks like a table. And I want to kind of stress this very much so, but table storage is not tables. It's an entity bag. How many people have heard NoSQL? NoSQL a little bit, maybe? So, okay. If you're like me, you're still half asleep. But table storage is really just what I would is an entity bag. So if I have an entity, if you think of, I just have a person object with a name, social security number, and age, that is like an entity. So when I save that entity to table storage, it's really just saving a bunch of key value pairs. So I have, name is Scott, age is old, social security number is, I'm not going to tell you. So anyway, 555, 555, 5555. So if I do that, those properties are just key value pairs are just created and saved into table storage. So it looks like a table, but it really is. If you see, when we look at our expense item, let's go back over here to this guy right here. We have a username, a title, a date, approved, a cost center, approver name, a reimbursement method. We go back over here, and we'll talk about partition row key in a second, and timestamp. But we have approved, approver name, cost center, date, ID, reimbursement method, title, and username. So those things just got mapped into table storage. So I save that entity. It's no different than in SQL Server when I have rows and columns there. The mapping is an actual physical name row to a physical column. You can do that here, but you can actually store anything in table storage. And again, I would recommend you go to a deep dive on table storage if you want to know more about that. But it's pretty similar, but I'll show you in a minute how it's not similar. But one of the key things in table storage that you'll see here, you'll look at this and you'll say, oh, partition key, row key, timestamp. What's that? That's a great question. Well, these are the default kind of key value pairs that are created in this. And the reason these are important is because your partition key, how many people have ever done partitioning in a database? Anyone? 1, 2, 3? Okay. Partitioning in a database is a pretty easy thing to, is not an easy thing to do, because you have to kind of say, where does this go in this database? Where does this go in this database? Maybe have multiple databases across everything. Well, if you think of it that way, that's essentially what table storage is doing. And a partition is basically a way for table storage to say, I'm going to put a set of like data together. And this, if you physically put that in a box. So if you think of if I was going to build Netflix, and I wanted to do everything by genre. If I said my biggest thing, I want to partition things out because I want to do things by genre. And you say, I'm going to put all the action adventures together, I'm going to put all the comedies together, I'm going to put all the kids together. And the reason I might want to do that is because when I start looking up data, and I've got millions and millions of movies to look up data, I don't want people who are looking up kids stuff affecting people who are looking up action adventure. So people who are querying on kids shouldn't affect people who are looking on action adventure. So if you've ever done any database, you'll put a big, huge index on things because it takes a long time to pull that data back. Well, what table storage does is kind of solve this problem in a way of saying, I'm going to come in and I'm going to go, oh, well, this movie you're asking for something from action adventure. So I'm going to exclude, I don't even have to look in the containers that has all of the other things. I can only just look in action adventure. And what the row key does is basically the other index for is the index for table storage that says, now, in this particular partition, here's the guy that you're actually looking for. So I've got a partition, and I say, this is the bucket that I'm looking for it in, and here's the row key, here's the index for the thing that I want to look at. So I can use that row key to say, like, do all kinds of link queries, and I'll show you that in a second, about where and when and how I want to look things up. But the reason I kind of went through that spiel is because when you move your application to the cloud and you have chosen table storage as the way you want to do things, these two things are the most important things to figure out. How do you partition your data? Partition and row key. Partitioning is the key. Because if you have a huge application with terabytes and terabytes of information, how do I want to partition this so that I don't end up with a bunch of hotspots? I want to make sure that the thing that I'm looking data up by is the thing that I want to put in that bucket. And then the row key being the unique, and that partition in row key becomes the unique identifier for a particular entity in that table. So partition and row key, if you leave nothing else today about table storage, those two things, very important. And that timestamp is basically gets added to every single one so that you can say, there's a lot of interesting things when you talk about table storage and those type of things. You can actually use a REST API. You can query for table storage data straight from your browser. So it's just WCF data services. You can actually query for it straight from your browser, and you can and it uses that kind of once you have your storage key and account key name or account name, you can actually put all that into a query string and actually query for data straight from there in table storage. But so it's very similar, but different. The other big key difference is as I said, you may be asking yourself is like, how do I add indexes to table storage? Well, that's a great question, but you can't. There's only two, or one really, if you think about it. But partition key and row key are the only real indexes. So when you start thinking about moving your data and you want to choose table storage because that's the way you want to go, another thing you have to start thinking about is if I need multiple indexes on data, is how do I actually redo this? And actually what that does is means you denormalize your data. Some people may cringe at that idea, but it's actually not a bad thing. And when you denormalize your data, you would then say, I might create a table over here that has a partition key and row key that says, all right, this is how I'm going to look up this data in, or I may have a partition that says, this is how I'm going to look up the data, and here's the row key for the data I'm looking up in a different partition or a different table. Does that make sense? All of you still with me, half asleep? Like me. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. So I'm going to show you real quick back in the suspense repository. I think we have it down here. You can actually use link queries just as you did before with table storage. So it's really no different. Again, a lot of the same things that you can do. And again, all we did when we changed from SQL Azure to table storage is we actually went and changed the data context. And a little bit of, as table service query, we changed a little bit of the code. So this is actually a more intrusive change. But we now have moved from being limited to maybe we are limited, we don't like SQL Azure because we don't want to limit the size, or maybe SQL Azure is a lot more money than what we would pay in table storage by just using table storage with our application. So you can still use link queries. You can actually use the equals operators and the compares, all the different pieces that you are used to in .NET, just like you did before. So not a bigger change, but still not all that complicated to do. It's very limited to the repository that we create for our expenses, and that's all we really had. That's the only code change we had to make in the application to move to table storage. All right, let's go back to the slides. So you can see that's just saying we're going to save those changes from the expense repository that we just went through. I want to talk a little bit about blob storage. How many people have done anything with blob storage? Anyone? Anyone? A few people? Okay. Just keeping you awake. All these questions are about keeping you awake. Let's go back to the laptop real quick. So before I do that, blob storage is basically another type of storage mechanisms. And you can think of it as almost like a file system. That's the way I look at it sometimes. But it really allows you to store any type of binary data up there. So if you think of it as images, or I can store HTML files, I can store Word documents, anything I want to up in blob storage. But if you think about your normal application, when I store images, I might store those on the file server. And I might say, if you think about an expense application, maybe I want to upload receipts to an expense application. Because not only do I have to, instead of submitting I/O expense through, or submitting expenses or receipts through I/O, inter-office mail, I could actually upload my image of a receipt, because everybody's got a scanner at their desk. And that actually then I can look at my receipt online, all those good things. And when I do, in a normal application, I might actually take and have the web application deliver the image back to it. So I might read that image from a file system, or read it out of a blob out of SQL Server or something like that. But when I use blob storage, it actually, and like I kind of hinted at earlier when I said when table storage, you could actually address table storage straight from your browser. You can actually do that same thing from blob storage. Dink. Thank you. And instead of me having my web application do a lot of work to deliver these images to the back to the application, I can actually get and have the application go directly to blob storage and pull that image out. Now, I know all of you are asking, well, how do I secure that? That is a great question. And you can do that. So when you actually go and get that image or anything else out of blob storage, and I want to make sure that it's secure, that I'm not having just putting that out on the internet for anybody to see, because my receipts are my receipts and I don't want anybody else to see or anybody else in my organization to see, you can actually secure those with shared access keys. And I'll show you that in just a second. But another thing that does, and it's really cool, is how many people use a CDN? CDN, a couple of you? Okay. So another cool thing that allows you, when you put those images and all those kind of static content in blob storage, you can actually, Windows Azure actually includes having a content delivery network. You can actually push that out to the CDN. So for example, not only now can I actually take the load off of my web application of getting that image or getting those things from storage, I can now even push that content out to the CDN. Windows Azure has a CDN. I think it has 22, 26 nodes. I can't remember off the top of my head. That you can push that out to, and now you can get all that content from a CDN network. So if you had large image files that were very static, so again, we go back to a movie database or something like that, and I want to put images of the movie of when I go that, I can push all that content out to a CDN. I don't have to worry about it. And now I've got all my content in blob storage, but it's pushed out to a CDN with Windows Azure. And it's pretty easy. You can go right to the portal, say this container goes out to the CDN, and boom, done. Again, not a big, huge change. So let's go look at how that works. And I want to show you the shared access key. So let's go to this last one here. So this actually has a little bit more in here, but we'll run this guy. We'll get him started. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually show you how you can upload receipts and what we've done to the application now. And this is the actual end result of making all these changes to our application through, and we'll go through one more thing that we did. But we've actually been, as we moved along, as you can imagine, now that I've got my application moved, I actually am making a little more modifications as I keep updating the application. Continue this website. I'm going to log in as John. And this is actually going against table storage. It's using, and I'm going to show you how now I can upload a receipt and actually get a shared access signature for my receipt that then can only be seen by me. And because if I try to address that out on the local dev fabric without that, and I have no idea why this thing is taking so long this morning to move itself along, then I can, then no one else can see it. And one of the things I'll tell you about the shared access key that you might want to think about is you give it a time. How long do I want that shared access key to go from so that that person can use it? So it's basically giving it a timeout. So if I look at, I've already put some information in here from yesterday, and I go look at this, you can see that I uploaded my receipt. I didn't have a scanner. They didn't spring for a scanner for me, so I don't carry one around with me. But you can see I have a receipt associated with this guy. And if I click on this receipt, you can see I've got Visual Studio receipt. I've got a bigger image of this receipt. But if we go and look at the properties of this guy, and instead of me trying to show you this, I'm going to copy this whole thing. You'll see this big, long URL. We'll paste it right up here into our browser, and we'll zoom in up here. You'll see that it's actually going, that property of that image is actually going to our local dev store account.
it's a relative path to receipt, thumbnails, and this is actually the ID for that receipt. And then it puts in all this information, which is actually that secure token that says, hey, basically, this is the time to live for this guy. You can only look at it for, I think we tie it to the session, 20 minutes or something like that. But that's one of the things you have to do is make sure you tie it to something that makes sense. So if your session logout time is 20 minutes and you set the shared access signature key to 5 minutes and the guy stares at that receipt for longer than 5 minutes, what do you think is going to happen? Probably won't be able to see it after that. So it's one of the things to think about. Make sure that you kind of keep these things in sync, because if not, it might get a little weird for people. But let's go look at the code that actually does that. We'll stop this guy. So, so if we go look at, oops. Oh, sorry. Expense repository. Sorry, I can't. Expense by user, get expense by ID. Here we go. So if we look at this code right here, let me get this out of the way so we can actually see a little bit more. This guy is creating a shared access key. So we're actually going out, and you can see we have a link query that basically has, we're going to get all the expense item information and the expense header information out of table storage, and we're actually going to create this key so that when we go out to, we're keeping these receipts in blob storage, we'll go out and get this key, we're actually going to send back the URL for where this actual thing is, but that URL is going to get generated using this shared access key. So we're going to create a blob container here, a client, and we're going to go through the client, and we're going to get this receipt. And when we get the receipt URL, oh, excuse me. And then when we return that back, we'll have a policy set for that guy, and we also have this no receipt if you don't have a receipt for that. We'll have a policy set for that guy that says this guy is going to come back, and we're going to have a time to live for the time span that we say. We actually just hard code this guy in here, just for simplicity's sake, which I think is we set it to 20 minutes. You'll get a shared access key so that only that person that has the key can actually see that receipt. And let me show you a little, and this is kind of easier to explain. Let me show you what blob storage looks like. If you remember what the URL for that guy was, blob storage kind of looks like, again, like a file system. But it's a container, and I can put a bunch of stuff in here. And what we do is we have, I'll explain the thumbnails here in a minute when we get to worker roles. We have a picture of the receipt. So if I looked at that guy and he downloaded it and said, that's kind of the receipt that we had before. I also have a thumbnail of that guy. So I can have thumbnails and receipts so that I can display the thumbnail when I show all the rows, and then I can go back, when I click on it, I can just pop up a dialog that has a bigger image of the receipt in it. So pretty easy thing to do, but it also kind of helps you work through or kind of take some of that load off of your website. And that's a great use for blobs. Is if I can get any load off of my website, then I'm basically doing better, and I have to have less instances. So let's go back to the PPT real quick. So now one of the other things that you may want to end up doing is, I got a bunch of background processes. Remember we talked about at the beginning, when we were moving this application, I actually didn't put in the beginning, but this, when we scan that image and upload it through the website, how do we actually process that image and create that thumbnail for that receipt? You don't want to do that in your ASP.NET application. You don't want to actually tie up any threads within your application and have it do all the work, and especially because it's going to be a synchronous process, and that's not going to be fun for your website. So how do I actually do this? One of the best kind of patterns and practices around doing that is actually creating a queue of, say, I want to do some kind of work and have a worker role. So in Windows Azure, you have these two ideas. You have a web role, you have a worker role. Web role runs websites. Worker role does anything else that you want it to do. So I kind of use this as my end-all, be-all. But it basically does all these background processes for you. If you want to do receipt or image processing, if I'm going to do file processing, if I'm going to do any type of processing that could take a long time, I can do this asynchronously by saying, all right,
Worker role, I'm going to let you monitor this queue, and I'll show you that in just a second. How many people are familiar with MSMQ? It's a little bit, okay, good, bless you. It's pretty similar, but it's not the same. But it's basically say I can drop a message off into this queue, once I grab that message into the queue from the application, I can have the worker role pick that up from the queue. I see that there was a new image written out. So basically all my application did was write the image out to the blob container, grab that image, and then process that. I can have the worker role process the image and create a thumbnail. I can also have it do a lot of other things. And I can have a worker role that does multiple jobs. I could have a job per worker role. It just depends on what kind of things you need it to do. And by doing that, I can write out all that information, compress it, and then have that thumbnail generated back into the actual, back into the blob storage so that the application can read it. So it's probably easier to show you how this works, show you some code than it is to stare at that picture. Let's go back over here. And worker roles are pretty easy that way. So we have a little bit of code that kind of helps you create these jobs, but kind of explain this code a little bit. These job processors are basically set up, and you can have queues. And when these queues get created, these job processors can just watch these queues, and I can dump a message into that queue, and when that message pops off, these job processors are going to do it. And the receipt thumbnail processor basically goes in, and it says, all right, I've got this base job processor, and all this stuff is just code that we wrote because we had to write the same code over and over again. We kept going, okay, well, I could probably factor this out to like a base class or something and make it much easier to deal with. And I say, all right, I've got this base job processor, and now I'm going to, and he's watching this new receipt messages and where he's watching for that guy. And when let me go up here and show you this. He's basically running. And he's saying, all right, I'm going to get a bunch of, I've told it what queue to watch. I'm going to get a message off of that queue, and then I'm actually going to process that message. And so you can see all he's doing in here is he's just looping over, or he's actually in this big while loop, and he waits for so long, and then he runs again. And this big while loop, let's back up here, and this guy is right here. So this big while loop, if you think of worker roles and if you've ever done any Windows programming, there's a message loop that just runs until your application quits. Well, in a worker role, if you don't create like your own message or a run loop, the thing will just quit. So it'll run once and then it's done, and it'll stop and be done with itself. So you just keep that guy running. And all this guy is doing is he's just looping, and then sleeping for the interval that you set. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, you decide how long that is. And he's just sitting there looping going, oh, every minute or every 10 minutes, I'm going to look for some images, and then I'm going to process them. And so, go back to this guy here. All this guy did is he processed this message. I got a new receipt message. Basically, that message had a pointer to the URL where the image was stored and the ID for it, or the ID for that image. And it said, all right, I'm going to go get that image. I'm going to get that receipt image, and I'm going to process it. And it does a bunch of code to actually take it from a big image down to a smaller image. And then you can imagine that doesn't affect my ASP.NET site. All it's doing is running in the background doing that. And something I could have done in a Windows service or anything else on premise, but now I'm doing that in the cloud using the same exact thing. And I'm basically now processing that receipt, and I turn it into a smaller image, and I'm done. You could see the same thing where we also have this other one that does the exact same thing, but does for exporting all your expense. So once I have all my approvals, I might have a job that actually runs so if you imagine before you had a batch job that runs maybe at the end of the month, and every end of that month it would say, all right, I'm going to export all this information out to a file so that SAP can pick it up or FTP it over or whatever I want to do. So the same thing happens here. I can have a job processor that says, all right, every 30 days, I'm actually going to wake this worker role up. He's going to check for new approved expenses, or there's an approved expense message that was created, and all these messages that got all the approved expenses that got approved, or the expenses that got approved, I will then go out and create a file for all those and say, all right, I'm going to grab all those, I'll put them all out there, and bang, now I have a file that SAP can pick up. And actually, I could put that file on blob storage, and again, you could access it just like the same thing, so maybe have it at something in there, or I can FTP it back to a specific location. So when you actually move applications and you have Windows services and things like that, that's another bigger change where you have to go, all right, I'm going to redo this to actually incorporate this whole kind of message queuing semantic and job runner so that I can do those same type of things. If you were using MSMQ and you're dropping messages into queues and processing them from a Windows service, it's very similar to the exact same. It's going to be different code, but very similar type of running. So, all right, let's go back over to our PowerPoint. So the bigger question is, how much is this going to cost me? That's what everybody wanted to know, right? Well, that all depends. And these are the reasons that we kind of talk about what are the things that I need to think about that's going to do these things. And all the choices that I make about how I move my application to the cloud is going to affect how much it costs. So bandwidth costs, so coming out of the data center costs, so in and out of the data center is going to cost you. Storage is going to cost you something. My CPU, so if I can lower my CPU, if I can lower the number of instances that I need, that lowers the amount of cost I'm going to have. If I can lower the number of type of instances that I need. So if you go to Windows Azure, you have small, medium, large, and extra small now instances. If you know what that means. If you don't know what that means, you can come by the booth. We'll talk about that. But they're basically CPU sizes and memory sizes on your CPU size. You may have databases, depending on how much data you need. That's going to determine how much your cost and how many transactions you're doing. So if you're doing a whole lot of transactions, it might be cheaper to go to SQL Azure than it is to just go to table storage. Whereas if you don't have a whole lot of transactions and you don't have a whole lot of data, it might be cheaper if you think about how much it costs to store data and transactions on table storage than it is to pay a monthly fee for SQL Azure. So these are all the kind of things you need to think about. And there's some other interesting things you can think about when you terms of costs. Do I need to actually run this application all the time? So all the time the application is running, it's costing me money. And if you think about on-premise, it's doing the same thing. It costs you money, electricity, people, man hours, server utilization, all those different pieces. But if I look about how I need to do that, if you look at this little graph and we think about the expense application, these are how many nodes I need to provision. So in Windows Azure, I can provision how many nodes. So if I said you want to have at least 2, so you have some kind of failover there, and I have the website running in 2 nodes, I can say on Sunday through Saturday, it's always running at least 2 instances. So 2 nodes are running all the time. But during working hours, I want 4 instances running. So I add 2 more instances on top of that during working hours. But every 4 weeks, because it's the end of the month and everybody waits to the end of the month to submit all their expenses, I actually will add 4 more nodes to that on Thursday and Friday so that I'm actually running 8 instances so that then I can process things much faster, application runs much smoother, and then scale that back down to those particular nodes as I do it. So these are things you can think about. It's like, because Windows Azure allows you to do this pretty relatively easy, I can scale up and down by clicking a few buttons. I can go to the portal and I say, I want 4 instances. Or I might have some way of saying I can automatically go in and say, because there's a management API, on these days, I'm going to scale up to 4 instances or to 8 instances. During these hours, I have 4 instances, and then I'm going to scale it back to 2. And Windows Azure will take care of all of actually going in, adding a new instance, or adding those new instances for you, moving your application there, setting up the load balancer so that as requests come in, they go to the right or go to a particular application. So that can actually eliminate some of your costs too. So you're not saying, because if you were on a premise and you said, oh, well, I might need 8 servers, you would probably put the thing on 8 servers. And half the time, or 3/4 of the time, you actually only needed 2. So you paid for 8 servers when you could have used 2. So in here, you can get 8 servers for 2 days, or for 2 days out of the month, and the rest of the time you're running 2 to 4 when you need it. So all this information that we have is in this book. basically, I walked you through this book, minus the one of the cool things in here that probably don't have a whole lot of time to go into is the application lifecycle management. But I'll give you a little brief view of that. But how do I actually manage it now that I've moved from the cloud or from on-premise to the cloud? How do I actually deploy my application? How do I set up myself to make sure that only certain people have rights to the deploying the application? So I may want the developers to only develop locally, but I may not want them going out and messing with the production application. And how do I keep them from doing that? And those type of things. That's actually in the book. We talk about that. How you might want to set up different accounts for testing and production. You may want to have we have actual build scripts in there that actually show you how you could have manually set up TFS or have TFS automatically deploy your application to an environment every single time. And it's using some of the PowerShell Windows commandlets from Windows Azure. And it also says, all right, I want to go so that you could have a build server that says, I build my application and deploy it out to Windows Azure. On every successful build or every night I have a deployment out there. So then the testers can come in and go and test it against the Windows Azure each time. And again, if you want this book, either come by the Windows Azure booth or there's a Patterns and Practices booth out there in the Visual Studio in the purple area. I don't know actually what they call that area. I call it the purple area. And it's also available online. And all of our content and the code that I showed you today, available online. We are actually in the midst of updating this content right now. And for the 1.4 SDK and all that good stuff, I actually have it all updated. We just haven't actually pushed it out to CodePlex. And there's a couple more changes we want to make before we do that. Because there's actually, if you ever look at the code, there's actually a couple of bugs in the code on how we do the image processing and save the expenses in the actual worker role version. There's also another book. Another book, if you're interested in greenfield applications, this is actually a book based on developing multi-tenant ISV type application, but it talks you through, if I'm just developing applications for the cloud, and I didn't really start with an application, I want to just start brand new. Excuse me. This book will help you do that as well. A lot of information in there that we can't cover in an hour. If you want this book, again, stop by the booth or go by the Patterns and Practice booth, but stop by the booth. I will actually be there from 12:30 until 2:30 or something like that. You can get one for free. If you have to stop by later, I think they'll have plenty. Hopefully there's still plenty. You guys love books. I don't know what. Take them home with you. And this one's also available online. There's also a book on claims, if you're interested in that we did. We actually have a new one coming out that covers ACS. If you haven't heard anything about ACS, Access Control Service on Windows Azure, awesome, awesome, awesome. I love it. It's the greatest thing since sliced bread, at least in my mind. But it's also becoming a book that we actually talked about how to claims enable your app that we talked through a little bit today. Also talks about it using ACS. And if you have SharePoint instances, we talk about how you claims enable and hook other applications with SharePoint. And the last thing today, before I let you guys pelt me with questions if you need to, is a simple pattern matching exercise. You're all going to go online, log in, click on your session, and you'll see that in this general area over here is where you want to click. And these are kind of comments that you want to write. Good? Everybody got it. So when you go do that, you can do it now on your laptop or wherever you want to do it. Do that, and you're good. If you haven't seen them, come by the booth, get your free 30-day trial or access to Windows Azure. Here's all my information. Here's where you can find the claims guide. Here's where you can find more stuff about Windows Azure guidance. If you need questions or don't want to ask questions or feel things, you can. Here's my blog, Twitter, all the information. Feel free to contact me anytime. So anybody have any questions? I see everybody's leaving, so you're all either going to the bathroom or eat or who knows, have no questions for me because it was so awesome. And remember, fill out those surveys. General right direction is where you want to click. Anyone? Bueller? No, it's available now. If you go down to the expo hall, I think you can get one now. If we still have any left, I haven't been down there. I'm actually going to go down there now. But if you want one, go down there and get one soon. I'm sure they'll run out eventually. Yeah. So thank you. Yes. Oh, you have one question here. Wait a minute. Well, whoa, wait. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. I'll take any kind of accolades I can get.
When you're working with those queues, is there a way to notify the front-end app that you're worried about them?
Yes. That's a different problem, but it's kind of this. When you do something like that, you can actually say, I may want to register an IP address or something like that so that you can notify back. So you might have a channel open on the client, or you may have some type of thing to do that. You definitely don't want to keep a channel open constantly, because keeping one channel open all the time is kind of the more connections you have open is bigger holes for people to poke sticks through, and also can decrease your performance, because that's just another connection that has to keep that we have to keep open, and it costs you money. So it's usually easier to do something like have a channel registered or an IP address registered that you can just ping back and say, hey, I'm done. It's no different. I mean, you just basically, yeah. Well, a callback method is probably not best, because these two things run in different app domains. So having a callback method is probably not going to help you. But opening up like a channel maybe, or having a channel saying, all right, this is I'm going to listen on this channel, or you could have some open up a channel that says, all right, I'm going to listen on this channel. The worker role talks back to that channel and says, hey, I'm going to do it. So it could be like a WCF's channel or a TCP channel or something like that you can ping back. And you can do that right straight from within the data center. Anyone else? Yes, I see other people might have questions.
Are you guys going to have like a best practice for developing applications, specifically for like the retries and maybe?
Yes, a lot of that stuff is actually, so the retry is actually, I think we actually got it into the book. We couldn't get it into the code because some of that came after we had kind of finished up. But it is definitely in the developing book, and it's definitely available. If you go out to Bing and go to look for SQL Azure Team blog and retry, you'll find it.
Right, but I mean, are you going to have like this
Yes.
version of everything?
Yes, and we are actually in the process of updating both of these guides, because the moving application was done right when RTW of Windows Azure was shipping. So it was a couple of months after that. So it was actually done in Visual Studio 2008 and SDK 1.0. So you see me up here with VS 2010 and 1.4 SDK. We've actually upgraded all those things. We've just got to get it out there. We want to make a few more changes before we get it out there, because we just finished up the V2 of the claims guide. So now we're moving on to that, and we're going to update a lot of that content and add some new stuff that I didn't get to today. Well, I wanted to get to this multi-entity schema thing, but I didn't get to it because I was running low on time. I want to give you guys time to ask questions. I'm sorry? Oh, for using metadata for blob storage? Well, like what kind of metadata? Like what? I guess you're asking me for a scenario, so I'm like, I don't know of one, but what's the?
Okay, so when we have blob storage, it can store about 2 terabytes of data, right?
Right.
And there is several megabytes for metadata.
Right.
So what this metadata can be used for? As far as I right now thought about this, I can store version, for example, if it's
Yes.
are there any others?
I haven't seen or know of any off the top of my head. I mean, we use the content type and all the other metadata around blob storage to tell us interesting things, but we don't actually have anything. But it's a good question. Feel free to email me, and I can maybe find somebody that could answer that. But or stop by the booth. There might be a couple of people there that.